A photograph doesn't lie, they say. But what happens when two photographs tell two truths at the exact same moment in a town where everyone knows everyone and nothing ever changes? What if the impossible wasn't a trick of light or a double exposure, but something far stranger, something that makes you question everything you thought you understood about time, identity, and the very fabric of a quiet American town? In Cary, North Carolina, where the streets have names and the faces have histories, someone found proof that a man existed in two places simultaneously, and the deeper you look, the less sense any of it makes. This isn't about ghosts or folklore. This is about evidence, about photographs that survived decades in a basement, waiting to show the world something it wasn't ready to see. Before we go further, subscribe now, because the stories buried in small American towns don't stay buried forever, and you'll want to be here when the next one surfaces. Cary sits in the heart of North Carolina, a place where old money meets new growth, where historic homes stand alongside modern developments, and where the past has always had a way of lingering just beneath the surface. The town grew slowly over generations, built on tobacco money and railroad dreams, a community where families stayed for lifetimes, and everyone's grandfather knew everyone else's grandfather. There's a particular quality to the light in Cary during late autumn, the way it filters through old oak trees and casts long shadows across streets that have carried the same names for over 100 years. It's the kind of place where people still remember when Main Street was dirt, where the old general store stood, where the first streetlights were installed, and where certain families have lived in the same houses since before the Civil War. In towns like this, memory runs deep, and the past isn't just history, it's part of the present, woven into every brick, every fence post, every story told on front porches during summer evenings. And it was in one of those old houses, during an estate sale in the fall, that someone found a box that would change everything anyone thought they knew about Cary's quiet history. The box was unremarkable at first glance, cardboard worn soft with age, tucked behind old Christmas decorations and moth-eaten blankets, in a basement that smelled of mildew and forgotten things. Inside were photographs, dozens of them, black and white images from the 1950s and 60s. The kind of family snapshots that everyone's grandparents had. Moments frozen in time that once meant everything to someone. There were birthday parties, church picnics, people standing in front of cars that don't exist anymore, children who are now grandparents themselves. All the ordinary moments that make up a life in a small southern town. But mixed among these ordinary photographs were two that didn't make sense. Two images that, when laid side by side, created a puzzle that no one could explain, a contradiction that seemed to violate the basic rules of reality. Both photographs were dated on the back in the same handwriting, the same day, the same year, even the same time written in faded pencil, as if whoever took them wanted to make absolutely certain that future generations would know when these moments occurred. And in both photographs, clear as daylight, was the same man, wearing the same clothes, but in two completely different locations, doing two completely different things, at the exact same moment. The first photograph showed a man standing outside the old Cary Theatre on Chatham Street, a building that's long since been demolished, captured in the middle of the afternoon with the marquee visible behind him. He was wearing a white shirt and dark trousers, his hand raised in a wave toward the camera, his face clearly visible, smiling in that slightly awkward way people smiled for cameras back then, when photography still felt like an event. Behind him, you could see other people on the sidewalk, a woman with a shopping bag, a child on a bicycle, all the small details that confirmed this was a real moment in a real place, not some staged photograph in a studio. The shadows on the ground, the angle of the sun, the quality of the light, everything suggested this photo was taken around 2 in the afternoon, and the date on the back confirmed it was a Saturday in October. The second photograph showed the same man, in the same white shirt and dark trousers, standing in front of the Page Walker Hotel, which still stands today on the other side of town, nearly 2 miles away from the theater. But he wasn't waving in this one. He was helping someone load luggage into the trunk of a car, caught mid-motion, his face turned slightly toward the camera, absolutely recognizable as the same person, at the same time, on the same day. Now here's where it gets impossible, and I mean truly impossible, not in the way of strange coincidences or odd resemblances, but in the way that makes your brain refuse to accept what your eyes are seeing. The handwriting on the back of both photographs was identical, written by the same person, and the timestamp on both was precise, written as 2:15 in the afternoon, not an approximation, but a specific minute. The shadows in both photographs matched. The quality of light was identical. The weather conditions visible in both images were the same. There was no possibility that these were taken at different times of day or on different days altogether. And the man, when you looked closely at his face, his posture, the way his hair fell across his forehead, the distinctive way his collar sat against his neck, there was absolutely no question that this was the same individual. 2 miles is not a distance you can cover in 0 time, especially not in 1953, when the fastest way across town was by car on roads that wound through residential neighborhoods with stop signs every few blocks. Even if he had somehow run at an impossible speed, he couldn't have changed his activity mid-stride, couldn't have gone from waving on a sidewalk to helping with luggage without any transition, without any in-between moment. But that was only the beginning of what made these photographs so disturbing. The person who bought the box at the estate sale was a local history teacher named Margaret Chen, someone who had spent 20 years studying Cary's past, who knew the town's old families, who could identify buildings in century-old photographs just by looking at architectural details.
She recognized the theater immediately, remembered exactly when it had been torn down, knew the Page Walker Hotel from hundreds of historical documents. And when she saw these 2 photographs side by side, she felt something she'd never felt before while looking at old pictures.
It was a feeling of wrongness, of the world being slightly out of joint, of evidence contradicting itself in a way that shouldn't be possible, and she spent the first hour just staring at the images, checking and rechecking every detail, hoping to find the explanation. She examined the photographs under magnification, looking for signs of manipulation, double exposure, any technical trick that might explain the impossible. But the images were authentic, printed on period-correct paper with the right chemical aging patterns for photographs from that era. The grain structure was consistent throughout both images. There were no signs of splicing or superimposition, no telltale marks of early photographic manipulation. These were genuine photographs of genuine moments, captured by someone standing in 2 different locations. And the more Margaret looked, the more details she noticed that made the mystery deeper. Small things that most people would miss, but that told her these images were connected by something far stranger than simple coincidence. The man in both photographs wore a distinctive watch, visible on his left wrist in both images, an unusual style even for the 1950s, with a square face and what appeared to be a leather band with a specific pattern of stitching. In the theater photograph, you could see a small stain on his right cuff, just above the wrist, a dark spot that looked like ink or coffee, and when Margaret examined the hotel photograph with a magnifying glass, there it was, the exact same stain in the exact same position. The way his shirt wrinkled across his shoulders was identical in both images, suggesting these weren't just the same clothes, but the same wearing of those clothes, the same moment of existence captured from 2 impossible vantage points. His expression was different in each photo, responsive to different situations, but the underlying structure of his face, the way his eyes caught the light, the specific angle of his jaw, all of it matched with the kind of precision that meant this wasn't a twin or a look-alike. Margaret had seen thousands of old photographs, had studied family resemblances across generations, knew how to spot the difference between siblings and the same person photographed twice, and this was definitely the same man, existing in 2 places, doing 2 things, at exactly the same moment. She took the photographs to 3 different experts, people who specialized in historical document authentication, and all of them confirmed what she already knew. These were genuine period photographs with no evidence of tampering, no explanation for the impossibility they presented. The estate sale had been held at a house on West Chatham Street, a Victorian home that had belonged to the Hayward family for 3 generations, and Margaret began investigating who might have taken these photographs and why. The last Hayward to live in the house was a woman named Dorothy, who had died at 97 without any children, and the estate was being liquidated by distant cousins who had never even visited Cary. Dorothy had lived alone for the last 30 years of her life, a quiet woman who kept to herself, who was known in the neighborhood as polite but distant. someone who seemed to be waiting for something that never quite arrived. Her house had been filled with the accumulated possessions of multiple generations, furniture from the 1800s, clothes from every decade of the 20th century, boxes and boxes of family documents that no one had looked through in years. Margaret tracked down one of Dorothy's few remaining friends, a woman in her 80s who remembered Dorothy talking sometimes about her father, a man who had been obsessed with photography back when it was still a relatively new and expensive hobby. The friend remembered Dorothy saying once that her father had been trying to prove something with his photographs, something about time or memory or the way moments connect to each other, but she'd never understood what he meant, and Dorothy had never explained it clearly. Margaret spent weeks going through public records, looking for any information about Dorothy's father, a man named Robert Hayward, who had lived in Cary from the 1920s until his death in the early 1970s. Robert had worked as a surveyor for the county, a job that required precision and attention to detail, that involved measuring distances and calculating angles, understanding the relationship between points in space. He had been, according to old newspaper clippings, an amateur inventor, someone who tinkered with cameras and lenses, who had built his own darkroom in the basement of the Chatham Street house, who had spent countless hours experimenting with photographic techniques. There were references in the Cary newspaper to a presentation he'd given at the library in 1956 about the nature of time and photography, a talk that had been attended by fewer than a dozen people and was described in the paper as interesting but somewhat incomprehensible. The photographs Margaret had found were definitely taken with professional equipment, the kind of clarity and composition that came from someone who understood the technical aspects of photography, who knew exactly how to capture a moment with precision. And if Robert Hayward had been experimenting with photographic techniques in the early 50s, if he'd been obsessed with proving something about time and moments, then these two impossible photographs might have been exactly what he was trying to create. But here's what Margaret couldn't understand, and what still doesn't make sense even now. Robert Hayward wasn't just the photographer, he was the subject. The man standing in both locations was Robert himself. She found other photographs of Robert from the same era, images from church directories and county records, and there was no question. The man waving outside the theater and the man helping with luggage at the hotel was the same person who had supposedly been behind the camera. So who had taken these photographs if Robert was in both of them? And how had he managed to set up two cameras in two locations 2 miles apart, triggered at exactly the same second, while also being present in both frames? The technical challenges alone seemed insurmountable for the 1950s. This wasn't the era of digital cameras and remote triggers. This was the age of manual film cameras that required someone to be present, to look through the viewfinder, to press the shutter at the precise right moment. Even if Robert had somehow constructed elaborate timing mechanisms, even if he'd built remote triggers operated by clockwork or electrical signals, he still couldn't have been in two places at once, couldn't have stood in two different locations while simultaneously being in both photographs. Unless, and this is where Margaret's thinking began to go in directions she'd never considered before, unless the photographs weren't documenting two separate events, but rather something else entirely, something that challenged the basic assumption of how time works. Stay with me here because what comes next requires you to suspend everything you think you know about how moments happen and how they're captured. Robert Hayward's old darkroom was still intact in the basement of the house on Chatham Street, and Margaret got permission from the estate to examine it before the property was sold. The room was exactly as Robert must have left it decades ago, still equipped with developing trays and chemical bottles, with strange notations written on the walls in pencil, mathematical equations and diagrams that looked more like physics than photography. There were notebooks stored in metal cabinets, journals filled with Robert's handwriting, describing experiments with exposure times and light sensitivity, but also theories about the nature of moments, about how a single instant might exist in multiple locations simultaneously. One notebook in particular, dated from 1952 to 1954, contained references to what Robert called location bleeding, the idea that a person's presence might somehow imprint on multiple places at once if the conditions were exactly right. He wrote about synchronization points, moments when the barrier between locations becomes thin, when a single consciousness might occupy two spaces at the same time, not through physical transportation, but through some kind of quantum connection he didn't fully understand. The notebook contained detailed notes about the photographs Margaret had found, describing them as proof of concept, evidence that his theories weren't just abstract ideas, but observable phenomena, captured on film for anyone willing to look closely enough. Robert had written that the photographs were taken on a Saturday afternoon in October of 1953, and that he had spent months preparing for that specific moment, calculating angles and timing and atmospheric conditions. He'd noted the exact position of the sun, the temperature, the humidity, even the number of people likely to be on the streets at that particular time, as if all of these factors mattered for what he was trying to achieve. According to his notes, he had been thinking intensely about two specific locations: the theater where he'd first met his wife and the hotel where they'd stayed on their wedding night, two places that held powerful personal significance for him. On that October afternoon, he'd walked to the theater, stood on the sidewalk, and focused all of his attention on simultaneously being at the hotel, visualizing it so clearly that he could smell the old wood of the lobby, could feel the weight of the luggage in his hands. And somehow, according to what he'd written, it had worked. He had experienced being in both places at once, had felt himself divided between two moments, two activities, two versions of the same instant. He claimed that friends had been stationed at both locations with cameras, instructed to photograph him at exactly 2:15 in the afternoon, and that when the film was developed, it showed exactly what he'd experienced, his presence in two impossible places at the same time. Now, the easy explanation would be that Robert Hayward was delusional, that he'd somehow staged these photographs using a twin or a look-alike, that his notebooks were the ravings of someone who'd lost touch with reality. But Margaret checked birth records, death certificates, family trees going back generations, and Robert Hayward had no twin, no brother, no close relative who could have stood in for him in these photographs. The friends he'd mentioned in his notebook were real people, documented in Cary's historical records, and Margaret managed to track down descendants of one of them, a man named Thomas Pierce, who had lived 3 houses down from the Haywards. Thomas's grandson still lived in Cary, and he remembered his grandfather talking about Robert's strange experiments, about being asked to take a photograph at a specific time and being absolutely certain that Robert had been standing in front of him when he'd pressed the shutter. The grandson had old letters from Thomas to his sister, written in the weeks after the photographs were taken, describing how Robert had shown him the developed pictures and how Thomas had insisted it must be a trick, but couldn't explain how the trick was done. Thomas had written that Robert seemed different after that day, more distant, more distracted, as if part of his attention was always somewhere else, never fully present in whichever room he happened to be standing in. Margaret found references to similar experiments in Robert's later notebooks, attempts to recreate the effect, to once again exist in multiple locations simultaneously, but none of them seemed to have worked the way that October afternoon had worked. He wrote about feeling stretched thin, about moments when he could almost sense other versions of himself in other places, but couldn't quite make the connection solid enough to be photographed, couldn't quite achieve the same clarity of dual presence. His last entry about the experiments was from the spring of 1955, a note that simply said, "The window has closed. I don't think I can find my way back to that state. The world feels singular again, disappointingly linear." After that, the notebooks became more conventional, filled with ordinary photography notes about exposure and composition, as if Robert had given up on whatever he'd been trying to prove and returned to normal life. But he'd kept those 2 photographs, had preserved them carefully, had written the date and time on the back as if they were the most important documents in his possession, proof of something that most people would never understand or believe. And then he'd lived another 20 years, worked his job, raised his daughter, grew old in that house on Chatham Street, carrying the secret of what he'd experienced, what he'd proven, what he'd captured on film that October afternoon. But the truth comes sharper now, and it's stranger than anything Robert wrote in his notebooks. Margaret began interviewing other longtime Cary residents, asking if anyone remembered Robert Hayward, and she found several people in their 80s and 90s who had vivid memories of him from their childhood. They described him as a kind man, quiet, thoughtful, someone who always seemed to be paying attention to things other people didn't notice, who would stop in the middle of conversations as if listening to something no one else could hear. One woman remembered seeing Robert downtown in the early 1960s, standing perfectly still on a street corner, and when she'd asked if he was all right, he'd said he was trying to remember being in two places, trying to feel that sensation again. Another person recalled Robert talking at a town meeting about how Cary existed in layers, how the present moment was always stacked on top of other moments, other versions of the town that were still happening somewhere in the fabric of time. People had thought he was eccentric but harmless, a dreamer with odd ideas, someone who'd probably read too many science fiction stories, and they'd smiled and nodded and forgotten what he'd said as soon as he stopped talking. But what if Robert hadn't been eccentric? What if he'd actually discovered something about the nature of reality, about how consciousness and location and time interact in ways that physics hasn't fully explained? Margaret took the photographs to a physicist at North Carolina State University, someone who specialized in quantum mechanics and the nature of time, and she showed him Robert's notebooks without explaining where they'd come from. The physicist spent an hour reading through the notebooks, and when he finished, he looked at Margaret with an expression she couldn't quite read, somewhere between fascination and discomfort. He said that some of what Robert had written, particularly about quantum superposition and the observer effect, paralleled theories that hadn't been fully developed until decades after Robert's death. Ideas about how consciousness might interact with quantum states. There was a principle in quantum mechanics, he explained, about particles existing in multiple states simultaneously until observed. And while this had never been proven to work on a macroscopic scale, with entire human beings, the theoretical framework wasn't completely incompatible with what Robert described. He pointed out that Robert's references to synchronization points and location bleeding sounded almost like descriptions of quantum entanglement, the phenomenon where particles remain connected across vast distances, influencing each other instantaneously. But then the physicist handed back the notebooks and the photographs and said that while the theories were interesting, the photographs themselves proved nothing, could easily be explained by conventional means, and that extraordinary claims required extraordinary evidence. Except Margaret had found something else, something she hadn't shown the physicist, something that made the whole mystery even more impossible to dismiss. In another box from the estate sale, buried under old tax documents and property deeds, she'd found a third photograph, taken from a completely different angle, on the same day, at the same time. This photograph showed Chatham Street from above, from what must have been a second or third story window, and in the distance, barely visible but definitely there, was the theater with a man in a white shirt standing in front of it. The angle made it impossible to see the man's face clearly, but the timestamp on the back of the photograph matched the others, 2:15 in the afternoon, October 1953. And here's what made Margaret's hands shake when she realized what she was looking at. In the far background of this third photograph, almost at the edge of the frame, you could see the distinctive roofline of the Page Walker Hotel. Someone had captured both locations in a single image, and if you looked very carefully with magnification, you could see two small figures in white shirts, one near the theater in the foreground and one in the distant background near the hotel. Margaret measured the distance between the two locations using modern mapping tools, calculating exactly how far apart these 2 points were, and then she calculated the field of view necessary to capture both in a single photograph. It would have required a specific vantage point, a particular building at a particular height, with a particular angle, and after checking historical maps and property records, she identified the building, an old office that had been torn down in the 1970s. There was no record of who had taken this third photograph, no notation on the back besides the date and time, no indication of whether Robert had arranged it or whether someone else had happened to be in that building with a camera at that precise moment. But the existence of this photograph changed everything, because if someone had captured both locations in a single frame, if both versions of Robert were visible in one image, then this wasn't about camera tricks or double exposures or carefully staged photographs. This was documentation of something that shouldn't be possible. Evidence that on one October afternoon in 1953, a man in Cary, North Carolina, had somehow existed in two places at the same time, and multiple cameras had captured proof. Margaret made copies of all 3 photographs, stored them in different locations, documented everything she'd found in a detailed report, because she knew this was the kind of evidence that could easily disappear, easily be dismissed, easily be forgotten. The house on Chatham Street was sold to a developer who tore it down to build condominiums, and the dark room where Robert had developed his impossible photographs was demolished along with everything else. The notebooks were preserved by the Historical Society, catalogued as the eccentric writings of a local amateur inventor, filed away with thousands of other documents that no one looks at unless they're doing very specific research. Margaret kept the photographs, and every few months she takes them out and looks at them again, searching for some detail she might have missed, some explanation that would make the impossible possible. She's shown them to dozens of people over the years, some who dismiss them immediately as obvious fakes, some who stare at them in silence trying to understand what they're seeing, and a few who get that same uncomfortable look the physicist had, the look of someone confronting evidence that challenges their understanding of reality. There are people in Cary who know about the photographs now, who've heard the story, who've seen the images, and there's a quiet debate among local historians about whether Robert Hayward discovered something real, or whether this is just an unsolved mystery with a mundane explanation that no one has figured out yet. But the photographs remain, 3 pieces of film that document something that either breaks every law of physics or reveals that our understanding of those laws is incomplete, and no one has ever been able to prove which explanation is correct. What makes this story different from other unexplained phenomena is the specificity of the evidence, the precision of the documentation, the fact that Robert Hayward wasn't just claiming something strange happened, but actually captured it on film. These weren't blurry images of lights in the sky or vague shapes and shadows. These were clear photographs of a man in 2 locations, with timestamps and witnesses and physical proof that has survived 70 years without being explained away. And if Robert really did manage to exist in 2 places simultaneously, even for just that one afternoon, then what does that mean about the nature of consciousness, about the relationship between mind and location, about the possibility that reality is far more flexible than we believe? There are implications to this story that go beyond one man's strange experiment in a small North Carolina town. Questions about whether time and space are as fixed as we think, whether the present moment is as singular as it seems, whether we're all potentially existing in multiple locations without realizing it. Robert's notebooks suggest he believed the experience had changed him permanently, that after feeling himself divided between 2 places, he could never quite feel completely present in one place again, as if part of him was always elsewhere, always reaching toward other moments and other locations. And maybe that's the real mystery here, not just whether the photographs are genuine, but what it meant to Robert to experience that kind of division, to feel himself split across space, and then to spend the rest of his life remembering what it felt like to be in 2 places at once. Subscribe now, because these stories exist in every small town in America, waiting in basements and attics, documented in photographs and notebooks, preserved by people who experienced things they couldn't explain and left evidence for us to find. Dorothy Hayward spent her whole life in that house on Chatham Street, surrounded by her father's experiments and theories, and according to the one friend who knew her well, she sometimes talked about feeling like she was waiting for something. She would stand in the old dark room in the basement, looking at the equations her father had written on the walls, and tell her friend that she could almost understand what he'd been trying to do, could almost feel the edges of those other moments he'd described. When Dorothy was in her 70s, she told her friend that sometimes when she walked through downtown Cary, she would see her father, not a ghost or a memory, but actually see him, standing in front of buildings that no longer existed, waving to people who had been dead for decades. She said she could see him at the theater that wasn't there anymore, could see him at the hotel as it had looked in the 50s, could see him existing in those other moments as if time had folded somehow, and the past was still happening alongside the present. Her friend had assumed this was just the confusion of old age, the way elderly people sometimes see the past more clearly than the present. But now Margaret wonders if Dorothy had inherited something from her father, some ability to perceive the layers Robert had talked about. Dorothy had never married, had never left Cary, had spent 97 years in that house, as if she was anchored to the place where her father had performed his impossible experiment, as if she couldn't quite leave the location where time had proven to be more flexible than anyone believed. Margaret tracked down the current owners of the Pagewalker Hotel, which operates now as a community center and museum, and she asked if she could examine their archives for any records from October 1953. They found an old guest registry from that period, and there, signed in on that Saturday in October, was Robert Hayward's name, checking in at 2 o'clock in the afternoon with a notation that he needed help with luggage. The hotel staff member who had written the notation had added a small comment in the margin, something that had seemed unremarkable at the time, but now seemed crucial. Guest seemed distracted, kept looking toward downtown. So there was documentary evidence that Robert had been at the hotel at 2 in the afternoon, checking in, needing help with luggage, exactly as the photograph showed. But there was also witness testimony that he'd been at the theater at 2:15, waving to the camera, existing in both places. How had he traveled 2 miles in 15 minutes when he was helping with luggage, when he was in the middle of checking into a hotel, when there was no time for him to have left one location and arrived at another? Unless he hadn't traveled at all, unless he'd simply existed in both places simultaneously, experiencing both moments as one extended instant. And the photographs were just documentation of something that quantum physics suggests might be possible, but that we've never actually proven could happen to a human being. There's a physicist named Hugh Everett who proposed in the 1950s, around the same time Robert was conducting his experiments, that every quantum event causes the universe to split into multiple branches, each one containing a different outcome. In Everett's theory, there are countless versions of reality existing simultaneously, and every choice, every moment, every possibility plays out in its own separate universe, all of them equally real, all of them happening at once. What if Robert Hayward somehow stumbled onto a way to experience multiple branches simultaneously, to exist in 2 versions of reality at the same moment? And what if the photographs captured evidence of those different timelines overlapping? The theory sounds insane, like science fiction, like the kind of thing that belongs in movies rather than in a small North Carolina town. But the photographs exist, the documentation exists, the evidence exists, and no one has ever explained it satisfactorily. Margaret sent copies of the photographs to research institutions, to universities with quantum physics departments, to anyone who might be able to offer an explanation that made sense, and the responses ranged from dismissive to deeply unsettled. Some insisted the photographs must be faked, despite all evidence to the contrary. Some suggested elaborate explanations involving twins or mirrors, or photographic techniques that didn't quite work when you examined the details. And a few simply said they didn't know, couldn't explain it, found it profoundly disturbing. The thing about evidence is that it doesn't care whether we're ready to accept what it shows us, doesn't care whether it fits neatly into our understanding of how the world works. It just exists, waiting for us to decide what to do with it. And these photographs exist, 3 pieces of film showing a man in multiple locations at the same time, preserved now in climate-controlled storage, available for anyone who wants to examine them, to study them, to try to explain them. Margaret has written academic papers about the Hayward photographs, has presented them at conferences on historical mysteries and unexplained phenomena, and the response is always the same: fascination mixed with skepticism, interest mixed with discomfort. People want there to be a rational explanation. Want there to be some detail that everyone has overlooked that would make the impossible possible through conventional means? But the longer you look at the photographs, the harder it becomes to maintain that hope. Because the truth is that sometimes evidence points to conclusions that challenge everything we think we know. And the choice is whether to dismiss the evidence or to accept that maybe, just maybe, reality is stranger and more flexible than we've been willing to admit. Robert Hayward died in 1973. And according to his death certificate, his final words to the nurse who was with him were, "I can see both rooms. I'm in both places again," which the hospital staff assumed was delirium, but which might have been something else entirely. Years after Margaret first discovered the photographs, she was contacted by a woman from Seattle who had found similar images in her grandmother's estate, photographs showing the same impossible phenomenon, a person in 2 locations simultaneously. The woman's grandmother had lived in a small town in Washington state and had apparently been conducting similar experiments in the early 1960s, trying to achieve what she called bilateral presence, existing in 2 places through force of will and concentration. Margaret connected with others over the years, people who had found evidence of similar experiments in small towns across America, all of them dating from the 1940s through the 1960s. all of them involving people who were trying to prove something about the nature of consciousness and location. It was as if there had been an informal network of amateur researchers, people who somehow independently arrived at similar theories, who believed that human consciousness wasn't as bound to a single point in space as we assume, who conducted experiments to prove it. Most of their experiments had failed, or at least had left no permanent evidence. But a few, like Robert Hayward's, had produced photographs, documentation, proof that something strange had happened, even if no one could explain exactly what that something was. And the question that haunts Margaret now is whether these people discovered something real about the nature of reality, or whether they all fell victim to the same delusion, the same desperate hope that we're more than our physical bodies, more than the single point in space and time we seem to occupy. In Cary today, there's a small historical marker near where the old theater used to stand, and if you know what you're looking for, if you stand in exactly the right spot, you can see the Page Walker Hotel in the distance, 2 miles away. Margaret sometimes goes to that spot and tries to imagine what Robert was feeling that October afternoon, standing there on the sidewalk, thinking so intensely about another location that he somehow made himself present in both places at once. She wonders what it felt like, that moment of division, whether it was painful or exhilarating, whether Robert experienced it as being torn in half or as being doubled, as loss or as expansion, as separation or as a kind of strange wholeness. The photographs suggest that whatever happened, it was real enough to be captured on film, solid enough to leave a trace in the physical world, significant enough that 70 years later, people are still trying to understand it. And maybe that's what evidence is supposed to do, not to provide easy answers, but to provoke questions, to make us examine our assumptions about what's possible, to remind us that the universe might be far stranger than our theories allow. Robert Hayward's photographs hang now in the Cary Historical Society, properly preserved and displayed, labeled as an unexplained phenomenon from the town's past. And every year people stop to look at them, to puzzle over them, to wonder what they're really seeing. There's a detail in the third photograph, the one taken from above, that Margaret only noticed after years of studying it. A detail so small that it's easy to miss unless you're looking for it. In the very center of the image, exactly equidistant between the theater and the hotel, there's a figure on the street, just a blur of motion, as if someone was moving very quickly, or as if the photograph captured them in the middle of transitioning from one location to another. The figure is too blurred to identify, but the shape is consistent with a person in a white shirt, and its position suggests it might be Robert, caught in the act of existing in both places, documented at the exact moment of division. Margaret has shown this detail to enhancement specialists, to people who work with digital imaging and historical photograph restoration, and they all agree that there's something there, some anomaly in the image that doesn't quite make sense. One specialist said it looked like a double exposure, like two images of the same person overlaid on top of each other, except that the rest of the photograph shows no signs of double exposure, no other overlapping images, no other evidence of technical manipulation. It's as if that one spot in the photograph, that one point equidistant between the two locations, captured something that the camera wasn't quite equipped to record, something that existed between states, between moments, between the places where Robert was simultaneously present. The last entry in Robert's final notebook, written just a few weeks before he died, contains a paragraph that Margaret has read hundreds of times, trying to understand what he meant. He wrote, "I have spent my life trying to prove that we are not singular, that the moment we occupy is not as small and limited as it seems, and I believe I succeeded once, for a brief afternoon, in experiencing the truth of this." He continued, "The photographs are not proof for others. They are too easy to dismiss, too easy to explain away, but for me they are reminders of what I felt, of being larger than one location, of touching multiple points in space with the same thought." He concluded, "I think we are all doing this all the time without realizing it, existing in multiple places through our attention, our memory, our imagination, but most of us never make it physical, never make it real enough to photograph." And then, in the very last line, he wrote something that still gives Margaret chills every time she reads it. "Sometimes late at night I can still feel myself there, at the theater, at the hotel, And I wonder if I ever really left. If some part of me is still standing in those places, still waving, still helping with luggage, still existing in that October afternoon forever. What if he was right? What if some part of Robert Haywood is still there in Cary, still occupying those two locations 70 years later, still existing in that moment when he proved that consciousness can be in two places at once? Margaret now teaches a course at the community college about local mysteries and unexplained phenomena, and the Haywood photographs are always the centerpiece of her curriculum, the case that students find most compelling and most disturbing. She tells them that the purpose of studying these mysteries isn't necessarily to solve them, but to remain open to the possibility that our understanding of reality is incomplete, that there are phenomena we can't yet explain with our current scientific frameworks. Some students dismiss the photographs immediately, certain that there must be a rational explanation that no one has found yet, certain that the laws of physics can't be violated no matter how convincing the evidence appears. Others stare at the images in silence, troubled by what they see, by the implications of accepting that these photographs might be documenting something real, something that challenges the fundamental assumption that a person can only be in one place at one time. And a few students, every year, come to Margaret after class and tell her about their own experiences, moments when they felt like they were in two places at once, times when their consciousness seemed to expand beyond the boundaries of their physical location. She listens to these stories, documents them, adds them to a growing collection of accounts that suggest Robert Haywood wasn't unique, that the capacity for bilateral presence might be something latent in all of us, waiting to be triggered under the right conditions. The photographs remain unexplained, and Margaret suspects they will remain unexplained for the foreseeable future, perhaps forever, because the evidence they present is too radical for mainstream science to accept without a theoretical framework that doesn't yet exist. But the photographs also remain real, undeniably real, preserved and documented and available for examination. Physical proof that something impossible happened in Cary in October of 1953, whether we're ready to accept it or not. And maybe that's the point of this story, not to provide answers, but to preserve questions, to keep alive the possibility that reality is more mysterious than we assume, more flexible than we believe, more open to consciousness than our current models allow. Robert Haywood spent decades trying to make people understand what he'd experienced, what he'd proven, and he failed. But he left evidence, he left photographs, he left notebooks, he left a mystery that refuses to be solved or dismissed. And now that mystery lives in Cary's history, part of the town's story, a reminder that even in the most ordinary places, even in quiet southern towns where everyone knows everyone and nothing ever seems to change, the impossible can happen, has happened, might be happening right now. The photographs prove it, if you're willing to look at them, really look at them, and accept that maybe, just maybe, Robert Haywood discovered something true about the nature of consciousness and location, something that challenges everything we think we know about being human, about being present, about being in only one place at one time. Some mysteries don't just ask to be solved, they ask to change how we think about what's possible. So subscribe to this channel because the next story might be the one that shifts your understanding of reality itself.